I'm interested, how did we evolve into thinking like that, equating happiness with material possession, whereas we actually desire maybe genuine happiness?
Da qajwe
among a number of issues that can be talked about along this line, sort of two things stand out. And one is we have this fixation of attaching tremendous difference between the idea of rich and poor, the powerful ones and the weak ones. So we have a tendency to make a very big gap, but failing to acknowledge the actual sort of fundamental reality. The reality is, regardless of whatever relative status or situation you are in, all people without exception yearn for happiness and well-being, and yearn for freedom from suffering. And so, but when there is this tremendous gap between the idea of rich and poor, and the powerful ones and the weak, and the illusions attached to how the haves have happiness and well-being, and the have-nots don't have happiness. It's a matter of fact that simply because somebody is richer doesn't translate into more happiness or greater happiness, or somebody is poorer doesn't necessarily translate into more suffering. In reality, it isn't like that. Another factor where the consumerism is so strong is that because people actually lack the true practical wisdom to see things for what they are, because we either deliberately or more likely in a confused way do not distinguish between wants and needs. And so more than often we prefer to label our wants as needs. And so therefore, once we think of this wants as needs, or has this mistaken illusion that what in reality is what we want, but we think actually it's something we need. Then where do you get all of these needs and wants fulfilled and labeled, more sake of sounding good, your needs, and once for these needs have to come from all the natural resources.
The path to liberation taught by the Karmapas goes back more than 25 centuries of history in India and Tibet. The trail begins in the 6th century BCE in central India, when a young prince seated himself beneath the Bodhi tree in Bodh Gaya to meditate, and arose the following day as the Buddha. Buddha's teachings, which was introduced to India and later to the world, has this basic message that enlightenment and other forms of spiritual attainment are accessible to people of all classes, races, and genders. This universal access was the logical outcome of the basic truths that the Buddha taught, that the causes of happiness and suffering lie within the mind of each person, and that everyone endowed with a mind has the same basic capacity to free themselves from suffering and attain lasting happiness.
The population increasing, and we're taking more from the planet, more from the earth. We're using more and more of the natural resources that you mentioned. And as a result, we know about the problem of the climate change and the mountains of waste that we produce, for example, because of consumerism. Now, how can we actually get out of this mental, physical, and systemic trap, so that we can actually change it for the better, recognize that interdependence, and perhaps, create a better planet for the future generation. And what actions can we do? It's concrete.
Okay.
So like with most things, we engage in things with an unrealistic assumption. And that is that natural resources are so vast, so great, they are just completely undimensionable. They're never going to be exhausted. They are inexhaustible. As much as we can use, as much as we can dig out, there is no end to what we can dig out. That is far from reality, far from the fact. 100 years ago, 100 years ago, if we had that kind of attitude, maybe it's sort of excusable. Now, after 100 years later, when we are confronted with the situations that we are confronted with, we just can't content ourselves with our assumptions. We need to acknowledge the fact of the matter that we are directly faced with. Nature, natural resources, the lack of it, the imbalances have introduced very directly themselves to us in the way of the damage and the harm. So, we are where we are. The natural resources are diminishing at some incredible rate. This, of course, by the truth of interdependence, affecting the environment. Yes, we do understand, but we only understand with our brain. We don't act with our heart and with action. And so that again continues. What is in the best interest for down the road, in the future, is put aside. It is not enough. Like, for instance, we right now live in a world and situation where we are not short of information. We are not short of ideas. We are not short of researchers. But ideas, information, and researchers are not enough. You need to translate them on the ground, in action. What is also good for you as well as for others. And what is good for this generation and what will be good for the coming generation. And so that these things need to be put together. And for that, information, knowledge alone is not at all sufficient. There has to be a drastic change, a sort of holistic change in the motivation, attitude with which we address things in a fundamental way.